They assumed she was just another suspicious black woman, unaware she was the most formidable lawyer in the state. It was past 11, but Monica Jefferson remained unhurried. She had spent the day battling case after case in court, her mind a relentless war zone of arguments, evidence, and closing remarks. Now, all she wanted was to refuel and head home. Pulling into a Chevron station in Birmingham, Alabama, she exhaled as the gas pump beeped to life. Overhead lights cast stretched shadows on the pavement, the night stillness broken only by the occasional rush of passing cars. Monica grabbed the nozzle, lost in thought. Maybe she'd pour a glass of wine when she got home, or finally finish the book collecting dust on her nightstand. She didn't notice the squad car arriving until its doors slammed shut. 2 officers emerged, one older, broad-shouldered, exuding authority, the other younger, watchful, mirroring his partner's every move. Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker. She sensed their eyes on her before even turning. That look, one she had encountered countless times in court. "Ma'am," Matheson called, his stride firm. "We need to see some ID." Her hand froze on the pump. She glanced up, already anticipating where this was going. "Why?" "Routine check," he replied, tone clipped and rehearsed. She took a slow breath, observing them. No one else was around. No one else was being questioned. Just her. Pulling out her wallet, she kept her voice steady. "I'll show you my ID, but first, tell me why you stopped me." Barker stepped in. "There's a report of a stolen black Lexus nearby. Yours fits the description." Monica nearly laughed. She had owned this vehicle for 4 years, plates registered in her name, insurance under her policy. Who reported it stolen? Matheson's gaze hardened. "Let's not make this difficult." She stood firm. She had faced worse: murder trials, federal corruption cases, criminals with everything to lose. Still, she knew when not to push. Handing over her ID, she kept her expression neutral as Matheson took it. Barker circled the car, his hand grazing the hood like searching for clues. "Step away from the vehicle," Matheson instructed. Monica's patience thinned. "You have my ID. Check it. You'll see the car is mine." Barker stopped at the driver's side, peering inside. "That a work bag?" Her eyes followed his. Her leather briefcase, an everyday companion in court, sat on the passenger seat. "Pop the trunk," Matheson ordered. Monica arched a brow. "No." His stance stiffened. "Excuse me." "You lack probable cause," she replied evenly. "My ID is valid. This car is legally mine. You have no right to search it." Annoyance flickered across Matheson's face. He turned to Barker. "Call it in." This was where things got dangerous. Monica watched the realization dawn in Matheson's eyes. The rigidity in his stance wavered for a fraction of a second before he masked it with a clenched jaw. Barker, less skilled at hiding his emotions, shifted his weight from foot to foot, fingers twitching near his belt as if hoping the right answer was holstered there. The silence stretched. A heavy, suffocating thing. Monica could hear the hum of the gas station's flickering lights, the distant roar of traffic on the highway. No judge, no jury, just power unchecked. Until now. "You need to let me go," she said, her voice even. No pleading, no anger, just a fact. Matheson's grip tightened involuntarily before he seemed to catch himself. His eyes flicked to Barker. "Uncuff her." Barker hesitated. "Sarge." "Now." The tension in Barker's shoulders didn't ease as he pulled out the key and unlocked the cuffs. The moment the metal clicked open, Monica rolled her shoulders, shaking off the phantom pressure. Matheson took a breath, squaring himself. "Look this." "Don't," Monica interrupted. "You don't get to explain this away. Not anymore." Barker took a half step back, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. "We thought." "I know exactly what you thought," she said, rubbing her wrists. "And I know why." A pause. Then Matheson exhaled sharply, frustration leaking through the cracks of his composure. "What happens now?" Monica studied him, weighing her options. She had every right to escalate this, to take it to internal affairs, the courts, the press. And she would. But first, she wanted them to feel this moment. To let it settle into their bones. Let it rot there. She reached for her badge, taking it from Matheson's hand with deliberate slowness. I suggest you think long and hard about that question, Sergeant. Because what happens next? That's entirely up to you. She turned without another word, picking up her purse, smoothing down the front of her coat. She didn't need to see their faces to know what she'd left behind. Two men standing in the flickering fluorescent light, realizing they had just set fire to their own careers. Monica walked away, her pulse finally slowing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Monica watched as Matheson muttered, "Take the cuffs off." Barker didn't move. I said, "Take the damn cuffs off." Barker fumbled, metal scraping against metal as he unlocked them. Monica rubbed her wrists, watching them both carefully. "Look," Matheson started, forcing a tight-lipped smile. This was a misunderstanding. But Monica wasn't smiling. She slowly took back her ID, slipping it into her jacket pocket. "Yeah," she said, eyes locked onto his. "It was. But misunderstandings don't come with handcuffs. And this isn't over." Monica stood still, her wrists aching from the cuffs, the weight of the moment pressing down on the two men in front of her. Matheson looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff without realizing it. Barker, younger and greener, kept shifting on his feet, his fingers twitching at his sides. "This doesn't have to go anywhere," Matheson said, his voice forced into something resembling control. "Let's just move on." Monica let the words settle. Move on. She had spent her career fighting for people who never got the chance to move on. People who were dragged from their cars, slammed onto pavement, humiliated in front of their families, all because of officers who saw them as a problem, not a person. She inhaled slow and steady. "You detained me without cause. You handcuffed me. You conducted an unlawful search. And now you want to walk away." Matheson swallowed. "We didn't know who you were." Monica's eyes narrowed. "And if I weren't the chief prosecutor, would we still be having this conversation? Or would I be in the back of your cruiser right now?" Neither of them answered. Barker finally looked up, his face uncertain. "Look, we were just doing our jobs." Monica let out a sharp breath. That excuse. That tired, lazy excuse. She took a step forward, lowering her voice just enough to make them listen. "You think this ends here? You think because you took the cuffs off, this all just goes away?" Monica's voice was steady. "You think this all disappears?" She tilted her head. "Tell me, how long have you been on the force?" Barker hesitated. 5 years. Monica turned to Matheson. "And you?" His jaw clenched. 18. 18 years, she echoed. "Long enough to know better." Matheson exhaled through his nose, his hands resting on his hips like he was bracing himself. "What do you want from us?" he asked. Monica studied him. "I want you to remember this moment. Because the next time you pull over someone who looks like me but doesn't have this," she held up her badge, letting the weight of it sink in, "they won't have the same power to fight back." She let the silence stretch. Barker shifted again, his face tight, eyes darting between her and his partner. Finally, Matheson spoke. "Look, we screwed up. I get it." Monica shook her head. "No, you don't. But you will." Matheson opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, the crackle of Barker's radio cut through the air. "Unit 2 to 7, status check on that traffic stop." The dispatcher. Someone else knew about this encounter now. Barker hesitated, looking at Matheson for guidance. Matheson exhaled sharply. "Tell them we're clear." Barker hesitated just a second too long. Guilt is a heavy thing to carry. But eventually, he pressed the button. "Unit 2 to 7, all clear." Monica nodded. "Good. Now I suggest you both go home and think real hard about what just happened." She turned toward her car, reaching for the door handle. But then, as if something had just clicked into place, a slow realization crept into Matheson's face. "What department did you say you worked for?" he asked carefully. Monica smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I didn't. She slid into her seat, closed the door, and started the engine. As she pulled away, she didn't need to look in the rearview mirror to know they were still standing there, their world suddenly much smaller than it had been 10 minutes ago. Because they had just wrongfully arrested the woman leading the investigation into their department. And tomorrow morning, they would wake up to a nightmare they couldn't walk away from. The next morning, Monica sat at her desk, staring at the stack of case files in front of her. The irony wasn't lost on her. For months, she had been reviewing complaints against officers in the Birmingham Police Department, each one outlining patterns of racial profiling, excessive force, and unlawful stops. Each one filled with names of people who had been humiliated, arrested, or worse, all because officers made a mistake. And now her own name belonged in one of those files. A knock at the door pulled her out of her thoughts. Her assistant, Clara Rodriguez, stood there. Monica looked up as her assistant, Clara Rodriguez, poked her head in. They're here. Monica exhaled. Send them in. The door opened wider, and Police Chief Walter Grayson stepped inside, his expression tight and unreadable. Behind him, Internal Affairs Investigator Samuel Owens carried a manila folder tucked under his arm. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. Grayson cleared his throat. I saw the footage. Monica's fingers tapped against the edge of her desk. The gas station cameras had caught everything. I assume you also saw the part where they put me in handcuffs, she said coolly. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line. I won't defend them. What happened last night was unacceptable. Monica tilted her head. Then you already know what comes next. Owens set the folder down, flipping it open. Inside were disciplinary reports, Matheson and Barker's names stamped across multiple complaints. Monica glanced down. How many? Grayson hesitated. Monica looked up sharply. How many? Owens answered instead. 14 complaints against Matheson. 9 against Barker. Mostly racial bias claims. Monica let that sink in. And yet they were still patrolling the streets. She leaned back in her chair. You know, when I started looking into this department, I had a theory. She folded her hands together. I assumed the problem was systemic, that leadership turned a blind eye. But last night, I realized something else. Grayson's eyes flickered. And what's that? She held his gaze. The problem isn't just the system. It's that officers like Matheson and Barker think they're untouchable. Grayson shifted. I'll be placing both of them on administrative leave. That's not enough, Monica cut in. Owens watched her carefully. What do you want? She leaned forward, her voice firm. I want them off the force. Grayson tensed. Monica, you know how difficult it is to fire an officer with union protections. Even with the footage, the appeals process could drag on for months. Then let's make sure they don't appeal. Grayson exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. You're asking me to throw them to the wolves. Monica's expression didn't change. No, I'm asking you to hold them accountable, for once. Owens shifted in his seat. If we charge them, the department will take a hit. It's already under scrutiny. Monica let out a short laugh. You're worried about the department's image? I was humiliated, handcuffed, and illegally detained by 2 officers with a history of misconduct. If you think I'm letting this go, you don't know me at all. A long silence settled between them. Grayson exhaled. What charges are you recommending? Monica didn't hesitate. Unlawful detention, misconduct, and abuse of power. Grayson's shoulders sagged. He knew there was no way around this. Fine. Owens nodded. I'll draft the paperwork. Monica stood. And one more thing. They both looked at her. I want a press conference. Grayson frowned. You sure about that? Monica's eyes darkened. I'm done handling things quietly. It's time the public knows exactly who's protecting them. Because if Matheson and Barker could do this to her, a woman with power and influence, What were they doing to people who had no voice at all? This wasn't just about justice. This was about making sure it never happened again. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras clicking every few seconds. The gallery overflowed with spectators, community members, activists, other officers watching the proceedings in silence. At the defendant's table, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker sat in stiff suits, their badges removed, their futures uncertain. Barker looked down at the table, hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Matheson, jaw clenched, stared straight ahead, his expression carefully blank. Monica entered, the sound of her heels clicking against the polished floor. She had prosecuted criminals, corrupt officials, even officers before. But this was different this time. She was both the prosecutor and the victim. She took her seat, setting down her notes. Today wasn't just about these two men. It was about the entire system that had allowed them to operate unchecked. The judge entered, calling the courtroom to order. The proceedings began. The prosecutor, Monica's colleague, Assistant D.A. Leonard Briggs, stood. Your Honor, the people will show that the defendants, Sergeant Greg Matheson and Officer Kyle Barker, engaged in an unlawful detention, violated the rights of the victim, and abused their authority under the color of law. Matheson's attorney, Victor Langley, rose next. His voice was smooth, practiced. Your Honor, my clients acted within the scope of their duties. This was a misunderstanding, not an intentional act of misconduct. A misunderstanding. Monica kept her expression neutral. A misunderstanding doesn't come with handcuffs. Briggs called the first witness, the gas station manager. I was inside watching the cameras. The man testified she was just pumping gas. Then those two showed up, and you could tell right away. They weren't there to help. Briggs played the surveillance footage. Every second of the wrongful stop played out on screen. The moment Matheson demanded ID. The moment Barker circled the car. The moment Monica was grabbed, restrained and cuffed, and then the moment their faces changed when they saw her badge. Briggs let the footage roll a few seconds longer, letting the weight of it settle in the room. Do these officers appear to have any reason for making the arrest? He asked. No, sir. The manager answered. They just wanted to. Matheson shifted in his seat. Barker kept his head down. Next, Barker was called to testify. He hesitated, glancing at Matheson, before finally standing and making his way to the witness stand. Briggs leaned forward. Officer Barker, let's talk about that night when you approached Miss Jefferson. What did you suspect her of? Barker swallowed. There was a report of a stolen vehicle, matching the description. Briggs raised an eyebrow. Did you confirm the report before approaching her? Barker hesitated. Not at that moment. Briggs stepped closer. So you had no actual reason to suspect her? Barker shifted. We, just wanted to be sure. Briggs turned to the jury. Wanted to be sure, that's the reasoning. Not probable cause, not evidence. Just a gut feeling. He turned back to Barker. At what point did you realize you had detained the chief prosecutor of this state? Barker's face reddened. After we ran her ID. And yet you still handcuffed her. First a long pause. Barker finally muttered, yes. Matheson's attorney objected. But the damage was already done. When it was Monica's turn to take the stand, she spoke clearly, firmly. I have spent my career ensuring that people are treated fairly under the law. She told the court. These officers treated me as a criminal first, a citizen second. The only reason I am standing here today, instead of sitting in jail, is because of my job title. That should terrify everyone in this room. Her words hung in the air. Matheson's face was stone, but Barker looked smaller, like a man realizing too late that he had ruined his own life. Briggs turned to the jury. The law is clear. These men abused their power. Now it's time to hold them accountable. And for the first time in their careers, Matheson and Barker weren't the ones in control. The verdict came faster than expected. Monica sat motionless as the jury foreman stood, clearing his throat. The jury find the defendants guilty on all counts. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Matheson's shoulders tensed, his mask of indifference slipping. For the first time Barker let out a shaky breath, staring at the table as if willing himself to disappear. The judge's gavel struck wood. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. This court is adjourned. The moment the judge left, the room erupted. Cameras flashed. Reporters surged forward, voices overlapping. Miss Jefferson, do you feel justice was served? Do you think this case will set a precedent? What do you have to say to those who defend these officers? Monica met the press head-on, stepping in front of the microphones, with the same composure she had carried from the moment she was shoved into handcuffs. Let me be clear, she said, voice steady but firm. This was never about revenge. This was about accountability. She scanned the sea of cameras. This case matters because it proves something we already knew. When the system works bad, officers don't walk away unscathed. But it shouldn't take a courtroom, a high-profile trial, or the right job title for someone to get justice. The weight of those words settled over the crowd. Sergeant Matheson and Officer Barker thought they could act without consequence. That belief ends today. She let her gaze sweep across the cameras. And if there are others wearing a badge who share that mindset, let this be your warning. With that, she stepped back, ignoring the next barrage of questions. Justice had been served, but her work was far from over. Matheson and Barker lost their badges. Barker, given his lesser role, received probation and community service. Matheson, with his long history of misconduct, was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. For the first time, he would be on the other side of the law. Yet, the victory felt hollow. A week later, Monica sat in her office, staring out the window as the city carried on. How many cases like hers had gone unheard? How many people had been stopped, searched, arrested, and humiliated, without the power to fight back? She reached for the file on her desk. Another complaint. Another name. Another battle. She exhaled and opened it. Justice wasn't a single moment. It was a constant fight. And she wasn't done. Monica's experience was far too common. The only difference? She had power, something most victims didn't. If she had been just another black woman at a gas station, with no badge, no influence, just a person trying to get home, would those officers have let her go? Would they have apologized? Or would they have justified their actions until she was behind bars? Another statistic, another case swept under the rug. This wasn't just about 2 bad cops losing their jobs. It was about a system that allowed them to thrive in the first place. So ask yourself, how many more are out there? And how many more will it take before real change happens? If you believe in accountability, if you believe justice shouldn't depend on status, share this story. The more people who hear it, the harder it becomes to ignore. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more stories that challenge the system and demand the truth. Because the fight isn't over. Not yet.